Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Workplace culture and governance is never far from the headlines, but a series of extremely high-profile incidents at ASX-listed companies have seen the issue hit the headlines in recent months. From miners to tech companies and media groups and banks, workplace culture and the behaviour of some senior management is, again, regrettably, in need of repair. Perhaps the most high-profile allegations have been about the private life of WiseTech Global founder and CEO Richard White. It saw him step down from the role. So, does Australian business have a culture problem? How do modern companies make their workplaces safe and productive? Elizabeth Broderick AO is a former Australian Sex Discrimination Commissioner. She's now the founder and principal of Elizabeth Broderick Co, working with companies and organisations to transform workplace culture. Liz, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thanks very much, Sean. Wonderful to be with you today.
Why are we still having this conversation, Liz? I think the first time I met you, we had this conversation. That was probably 15 years ago. Why are we still having it?
Yes, it's a bit depressing that we are still having the conversation, but I think it has become more and more urgent, Sean. The reason I say that is that the authorising environment has changed. So 15 years ago, when you and I were having this conversation, there was less interest. The community was less interested in these issues. But I think increasingly we've seen the community shift, probably also because of a Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, but also more stringent legislation here in Australia, which means there's an obligation on employers to actually prevent. And I think that's one of the reasons that's brought the issue of culture into focus.
Is it all about the top? I mean, the WiseTech example I gave, that is about the CEO. Nine Media doesn't seem to be about the CEO. It's kind of more some senior managers. Without going into the specifics of any particular case, how important is the behaviour of boards, CEOs, CFOs, CIOs, the C-suite?
It's absolutely critical, the behaviour of leaders. And the reason I say that is that the tone is set at the top. So if you've got a board who either is behaving in problematic ways or really doesn't care, it's unlikely you're going to see a shift in the culture below that. So leaders have an outsized impact. And it's so interesting, Sean, because when I go into organisations, I'll speak to often the board, CEO and exco, and I'll be told, well, we think we've got some issues. But instead of thinking those people over there have got issues, I always say the starting point is let's reflect on our own behaviour as leaders. Are we proud about the organisation that we're leading? What part have we played in what's good about the culture, but also some of the harmful and problematic behaviours that might be being observed. So I can't stress enough that cultural and healthy culture starts at the top of the organisation.
Do you think some boards don't realise that? It sounds fairly self-evident what you said, but when you ask that question, do some of them think, oh, actually, I should have been thinking more about this?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, because some of them think it's an HR issue. So those people over there in HR need to get this sorted. Mm-hmm. No, actually, this is everyone in the organisation's issue. But as a leader, you have an outsized impact. So it's more important that you reflect on your own part, that that you're playing in what's good, but also some of the problems in the culture. That's absolutely the starting point. And I have to say, Sean, some of the most profound moments that I've seen in organisations is when particularly those leaders who maybe wouldn't have previously seen their behaviour as problematic, once they hear the impact that their behaviour is having on others, they have the maturity to actually stare into that truth and do something about it. Because when one of those leaders shifts, the whole organisation shifts, and that's a really positive thing to see.
Okay. What about the idea, you see this happen over the years, and the board is obviously balancing the idea of shareholder return versus behaviour of a senior manager. And, well, it's a bit unfair to talk about WiseTech again, but Richard White is still going to be paid $1 million and still going to be a consultant to WiseTech Global. Leaving aside that specific example, I suppose, but is the board doing enough? I mean, I get confused that someone's behaviour is poor and the board kind of thinks, we better keep them around for a while, and you see the share price sink and the person stays around and the share price goes up. How do boards manage that?
Yeah. I mean, my view is that everyone should be given an opportunity to change and shift. But if they can't or won't, and you're serious about having a healthy culture, one which is psychologically safe, then I don't think there's an option to keep people who are not, particularly senior leaders, who are not acting in a way that's congruent with that culture. So because in a way, Sean, culture's like the operating system in your computer. If the operating system's not working, none of your applications are working. And similarly, if your culture's not healthy, it's not inclusive and safe, then nothing the organization does will actually be at optimum level. So even its decarbonisation agenda, the acquisition agenda, all those things will be impacted by an unhealthy culture. So I think also boards fail to realise that one leader can have an outsized contagion negative impact as well. Some of the most interesting and uplifting moments I've seen in my work is when an individual who we would call a protected species because they're they're responsible for so much capability or profit or income or whatever it is, when they are moved on because of their problematic behaviour, the whole organisation lifts because for the first time there's been a line drawn in the sand.
Stay with me, Liz. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to former Australian Sex Discrimination Commissioner Elizabeth Broderick, the founder and principal of Elizabeth Broderick Co. We're talking about ASX-listed companies here. What about, so that's the private sector, what about the public sector? What about the arts? What about sport? What about education? You've done work in all those areas, I think. Is it the same deal there?
Yeah, well, we see similar kind of harmful behaviours across all the organisations. You're right. We've looked from command and control, sport, private sector, government, and everywhere in between the arts and creative sector. I mean, what I can tell you is that most of these harmful behaviours grow in the same soil, and that soil is a permissive culture. You know, things which are in some cases criminal behaviour today, if they're normalised and embedded into the culture, then these harmful behaviours, will continue. So yes, there are structural barriers which are different in different organisations. So you take a mining and resources company, for example, highly male dominated, similarly to the military or police, and we're seeing very few women in that organisation. And we know they are high risk environments for particularly sexual harassment, for some of the other harmful behaviours, because they are so male dominated. They're very overtly hierarchical. Power, travels in a particular way, particularly also where there's remote locations. So, there are elements which will make some organisations more risky than others. But I have to say, there's probably no organisation that I've looked at in any event that doesn't have these issues in relation to their culture. There's no organisation that couldn't be better than it is.
What about the rise of Donald Trump and the anti-wokeism push at the moment? How much does that hurt things, or it doesn't make that much difference?
Look, we need to see, but there's no question that there's been a pushback on particularly the rights of women and girls, so gender equality, but also LGBTIQ people as well. And this whole narrative around, woke and anti-woke. Now, I never use those words, mainly because the agenda that I'm on, which is an agenda, yes, it is about creating more diverse and inclusive organisations, but that goes to the safety of your organisation. The work that we're doing around culture actually is to ensure that everyone who has a right to be safe at work, and that's every one of us, that's your basic human right, that we have a right to be free from psychosocial risk as well.
Yeah.
So it's interesting when you look at sexual harassment, for example, if we treated physical safety in the way that we treat sexual harassment, we wouldn't ever discuss physical safety. We wouldn't ever report on near misses. We wouldn't ever learn from it. And we definitely wouldn't report it out because we'd be worried about the reputational risk. That's what happened in sexual harassment at the minute. So we know in physical safety, if I take a safety incident to my manager, I'm, celebrated for bringing early risk to the organization.
Yep.
But if I go to say that my boss is asking me personal questions about my sex life, not only am I not celebrated, but I'm seen to be a troublemaker. I can't take the heat. So it's a totally different thing. So what I help people see is that this agenda around diversity and inclusion is about safety, it's about better performance, and it's about increased capability, decision-making, innovation. There's so many reports that suggest that. So I totally reject the woke characterization.
Okay, but what about the Donald Trump, the fact that the leader of the free world is an individual who probably doesn't put safety at the heart of some of his decision-making?
Yeah, probably. But I'm trying to hold it gently. Sean, you can see I'm trying here.
Yeah.
I'm trying to hold it like a bold experiment to learn from what's happening in the US and to really see, okay, well, what will be the impact of that back here in Australia? And in a sense, what happened in the US around the election was feedback, if I can look at it in that neutral term. Depending on where you sit in the system, you will have a different lived experience.
Yeah.
And the trouble is, if some experiences are invalidated or indeed some voices are silenced, then you get potentially what we got in the US election. So what I'm trying to kind of reflect on is, okay, well, that's feedback that we've got.
Yep.
We need to engage with those who are just not engaged in this agenda, either not engaged in it or just think it's rubbish. We need to engage with them, but in a way that we can meet them where they're at. And it's not someone who looks like your mother preaching to you about gender equality. It's probably not going to bring you over the line. I think it's, much more nuanced and sophisticated. And in relation to men, because in many organizations I work in, there's a big backlash, and often it comes from men, not only men, sometimes it comes from women. But the idea is to find safe spaces for men to be able to talk about the issues for them, particularly mental health, but with other men, because all those issues are part of this agenda as well. So I think we need to get much more creative about it, and maybe the US gives us opportunity to test different strategies there.
And so it's probably not a solution, right? But is it a way to push it forward? Is about creating spaces, creating conversations, creating awareness. Is that kind of how we're going to push it forward?
Yeah, I think we're pushing it forward on a number of fronts. One is leaders, so leadership. We need to invest in leadership development because, I'd love just to legislate for human decency, but sadly we can't do that, Sean. We need leaders to understand that, changing culture or developing a healthy culture is probably some of the most difficult work that they will do because you're going to the heart of human interaction. It's what we call an adaptive challenge. That means there is no technical fix. We need to just keep testing and trialing and experimenting. So I think you'd be investing in leadership, but you'd also be putting in place strong preventative mechanisms. And that's about education. It's about helping people understand, how do I build psychological safety? Because we're dealing with human beings. We're going to make mistakes. These behaviors, bullying behaviors, racism, they are going to happen. The question is, how can you ensure that I feel safe enough to say something about it in the early stages? Because what we want is early intervention. So we're going to give people the skills to do that. And then we're going to be transparent about what's happening, because when we do that, we can learn from each other. And I'm loving some of the strategies in the mining companies at the minute. They use these alert systems. So if you, Sean, had your finger cut off by a machine, there would be an alert go around to all the sites saying, this is what happened to one of our team members. This is what we learnt. We need to update the maintenance schedule on the machine. And this is what we're going to do. What those companies are doing now is doing something similar, but for everyday respect or psychosocial risk. So what they're doing is saying, actually, one of our female team members was followed back to her accommodation by a group of men, leering and catcalling. What did we learn? Well, this is an example of sexual harassment, everyday disrespect, and we don't stand for that. What did we do? Well, that group of men are no longer on our site. or whatever the consequence is. I'm
Yeah,
not for
yeah.
a minute suggesting exiting is always appropriate, but it's just once again a reinforcement of the behaviours, and it's really a setting of what we call zero harm or zero tolerance. So I think there's a few strategies that organisations can work with.
Liz, I think you've done more in this area than anyone else in this country, at least over the last 15 years. I hope you keep doing it for the next 15 years because we will get there. I mean, are you confident we'll get there, or is it just an ever-evolving thing?
No, we absolutely will get there, Sean. And I think, look, as we see more women in leadership positions as well, because we know when you've got a better gender balance, the culture's usually better. So that'll be one thing. But yeah, we have no choice but to get there, Sean, because which one of us as a leader wants to know that human harm's happening on our watch and we're not doing anything about it? So none of us want that. So yes, we will get there. It'll take a little bit of time, but it'll also take some strong and intentional action.
Liz, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks very much, Sean.
That was Elizabeth Broderick, AO, former Australian Sex Discrimination Commissioner, and now the founder and principal of Elizabeth Broderick Co. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.